Good evening. This is Chipacon, and welcome to the Otherworldly. This is the uh, Changing Times, Changing Worlds show. And tonight, I have an old friend of mine from the SCA. Just you guys know me. Um, Faye Ringle is it has written a really cool book called The Gothic Literature and History of New England: The Secret of the Restless Dead. And because it's an academic book, it'll be a little expensive, but I say go to your local library and ask them to buy it. Then you can take it out and you can read it. You won't be able to write in it, but, but you'll be able to read it. And it's it's very cool. She's a professor of literature. She's into folklore, which is what we will talk about. I mean, she was in the SCA back when we were both young and very adorable. But tonight, her book is talks about the background of Gothic literature from Nathaniel Hawthorne and the old guys to Stephen King and the new guys. And a lot of it seems to resonate with me. And so here we go. Welcome. So, is there anything else I should say about you? Um, if
Well,
I
I
miss
could,
anything,
yeah,
you
I,
throw it in, okay?
well, I'm a retired professor. I'm a
Okay.
professor emerita of humanities from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, which was not where I thought I was going to be spending my career, let me tell you, and where they were happy if I wrote about anything. So I could research weird fiction and fantasy, the Gothic, and folklore and anything I liked, as long as I spent most of my time teaching basic freshman comp and introduction to literature. And that's what I did. And I've been retired for over 10 years now. And this book, The Gothic Literature and History of New England, Secrets of the Restless Dead, was written entirely during the pandemic without setting foot outside my house. Completely researched from my own library and from what is now available online. Back in the 1990s, when I wrote my first book, also about New England's Gothic literature and so on, I had to travel all over New England to archives, to obscure libraries, to interviewing old friends like Chipacon, uh, interviewing Stephen King up in Maine, and that was like the other extreme. And also, if I wanted to read the works of Cotton Mather, I pretty much had to go look at the original manuscripts at Harvard, or look at the really ancient books. And now they've all been digitized. So if I want to read a 17th century text, I just go on Project Gutenberg or or Internet Archive, and there they are. So
Cool. Yeah, I was just thinking that if your professor is letting you, encouraging you to read the cooler books, they're going to be more paying more attention. but, but folklore, I have to say, uh, I want to get more folklore into Changing Times, Changing Worlds. And do you have a comment on why folklore is important to study? Because
oh, I have lots of comments about that.
good, good.
Okay. So, first of all, for many years, folklore, yes, saying that yes, it's an important source of information about historical beliefs. We are getting further and further from the first generations of folklorists who were speaking to people who were part of a living community of belief. Today, folklorists are more likely to specialize in what we sometimes call contemporary legends or urban folklore or whatever. That is folklore being transmitted by the internet or by various other forms of social media, right? whereas the collectors of the 19th century and the starting in the late 18th century were working with communities where belief was in the supernatural was definitely an active thing. Of course, part of the problem was that the collectors themselves were likely to be skeptics and also to, ironically, view the people that they were studying as somehow primitive, inbred, possibly dangerous. And it's that kind of attitude that we find today in the genre of folk horror films and novels, where some clueless outsider stumbles into, it's always a sacrifice cult and something horrible happens to them. But that attitude was, common among people like Fraser and the Golden Bough and such. Yes, dangerous, primitive inbreds. Let's hear it for them. Yes, Howie and the Wicker Man is very much of that attitude. And it's that kind of attitude that we see in H.P. Lovecraft, that so many of Lovecraft's protagonists are professors who just happen to stumble upon cultists or, again, inbred, dreadful people still practicing the old ways. So I think it's particularly necessary for current practitioners of the old ways to look at that evolution, because you can have that perspective that academics maybe don't have.
Ooh, I'm seeing a comment in the chat, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. I'll have to go look for that. It turns the trope on its head hilariously. Never heard of it, but
yes,
I will go
Alan
look.
Tudyk, and I forget who plays the other one, but a pair of hicks out in the woods. A bunch of college kids are in the area, and the hicks are just trying to be friendly and welcoming, and college kids keep thinking they're going to be spooky and dangerous and making themselves wind up dead.
Well, okay. But there's something else that if I have a show where I don't come up with 2 or 3 books or movies to watch, it's very unusual. Okay, so yeah, I like the idea that our earlier sources, the things that I grew up on, were not unbiased, is not something we thought about. I bought Margaret Murray's stuff, hook, line, and sinker.
Now, yeah, I mean, that gets into another whole issue.
Right.
I've been mainly talking about the American Gothic and the collectors of the Americas, but in Europe and in Britain, there really, there's just could talk forever about it. And I think that's probably a distraction, but yeah, Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult.
Topic.
Sorry. But for a more recent scholar covering some of the same ground and with much better documentation, I would go with Carlo Ginzburg, the Night Battles and the Cheese and the Worms. The Night Battles was really a groundbreaking discovery that by looking at the records of the Inquisition, you could actually see how the inquisitors were changing the narrative of the people that they were accusing of witchcraft and that they were torturing and so on, until they changed their story to match what the inquisitors wanted to hear. But in the earlier years, they were hearing about things like the night battles, the idea that there were these protectors, these good witches, the Benandanti, who went out into the fields and fought against the werewolves and protected the harvest and so on. And then how in the same area, maybe by 50 years later, they're telling the usual story of pact and satanic ritual, because that's what the Inquisition wanted to hear and what they wanted to write down. So yeah, Carlo Ginzburg, definitely to be recommended.
Okay, question from Griffin. Unmute, Griffin.
Griffin, you're still muted.
Yeah, wrong button. Well, you mentioned skeptics in a little while back, and I want to ask you about something that is a hot button for me, which is the difference between a real skeptic and a disbeliever. Because an awful lot of people who call themselves skeptics are actually disbelievers. And I've seen this referenced in a lot of cases to the point where so-called skeptics investigating psychic abilities extinguish those abilities by walking into the room. So I just want to make that point, and I don't know where it fits into your work, but well, the word skepsos means to contemplate, and a real skeptic will contemplate something until they know the truth of it, and a disbeliever will just say, "Well, I'm going to rule against, regardless of the evidence." So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, contrast the attitudes of the Society for Psychical Research in the 19th century with today's, as you said, psychic debunkers or psychic investigators, and it is quite different. There are still parapsychologists today who keep more of an open mind and are, don't come in with the idea that they're debunking frauds. But in the 19th century, the Society for Psychical Research in Britain and in America were much more open-minded. In fact, some would say too open-minded. For example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who tended to believe just about everything, and including the Cottingley fairies, which we see as an obvious one.
The old saying, his mind is so open the wind whistles through it.
Yes. But beyond that, I'm not myself a psychic investigator. I have friends who are, but I'm not really an expert in that. I did do an adult ed course some years back here in Eastern Connecticut, and I got the student evaluations along the lines of, Professor Ringel isn't a real ghost hunter. She doesn't have any equipment. And that's really become the sort of paradigm today. They signed up. They didn't want to hear stories or legends or folklore. They wanted to know, they wondered why I didn't have the arsenal of ghost hunters on TV and movies.
Oh, well, what can you do? But your area is the folklore. Did we mention the dedication to your book, which I loved? I think we did before we came on.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Because I've always loved monsters, and monsters and the Gothic go together, and so I dedicated it to the monsters who scare us, who are us.
And that's New England. That's
yes.
Yes. This book was just very eye-opening for me about where the horror comes from.
Well, certainly in New England, we have the legacy of the Puritans, and even though only some of us, I don't know how many on this particular call are actually descended from some of the Puritan settlers. I'm certainly not. But we have that legacy, and that legacy has haunted us from the 17th century through, as Chippewa said, Hawthorne in the 19th century, who was himself the great-grandson of one of the witch trial judges, to Stephen King, who has always been conscious of Hawthorne in his background, and wrote a wonderful story that was kind of his homage to Hawthorne, called The Man in the Black Suit, in which he retells young Goodman Brown, really, of the encounter with the devil in the forest. But it's as Lovecraft wrote, he who could be more Gothic than the Puritans, given that they slaughtered entire races in the name of the Lamb. This is, and it's that genocide. In fact, people don't realize that Cotton Mather was one of the first people to use the word genocide, and he was applying it to the destruction of the Pequot tribe.
And approved of it.
And approve. Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's it's scary. Because we can see that in us, and that's the scary part, is you don't want to be the bad guy.
No. Jenna, is it a thunderstorm where you are? Well, can't hear you.
Oh well.
Just hold a thumbs up if you can hear us. Okay.
Yeah.
I know she's in her car. That much I know.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So
do you want to talk about the
it's hailing
trope of the wilderness? Obviously
yes.
the Puritans and New England are big on wilderness.
Well, big on, scared of. Now, while the world knows about the witch trials and the witch belief and the Puritans' attitude there, but what they don't realize is that that in fact there's even a word for the way the Puritans felt about the wilderness, and that is ecophobia. They had been taught the main stronghold of the Puritans in Britain was the eastern part of East Anglia. And it's not a coincidence that many of the names here in New England are after parts of Britain that were, of course, Puritan origin. Norwich, Connecticut, or Norwich, is named after Norwich, England, which was a Puritan stronghold. And that is the most flat, featureless, and absolutely no trees part of Britain. And Britain had already, by the 17th century, Boston, of course, Boston, which was a much more prominent city at the time they left than now. They had cut down all the trees for building and fuel and so on. And they'd been taught pretty much that the wilderness was where the devil was. That if you wanted to find the devil, you went into the forest. They land in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and God help us, New Hampshire and Maine. And what is there? There's nothing but forests. They were horrified. And yeah, that's the very word, that's the country or whatever. And so they also had the theory that there's the proverb, the devil finds work for idle hands to do. So people were supposed to work, and they were supposed to keep, to follow the rules and so on. And they found these people living here who didn't seem to be mentioned in the Bible. Well, who could they be but the followers of Satan who lived in the woods, weren't mentioned in the Bible. And therefore, unlike in South America, there really wasn't a big push to convert the native peoples to Christianity. Now, there were some exceptions, and they were wonderful, like Roger Williams and like John Eliot, who believed that these were human beings with souls, and therefore they could be saved. We might not approve of wiping out their culture in order to save them, but at least there wasn't this feeling that you had to literally wipe them off the face of the earth in genocide. But for the first, particularly the first generation or two of settlement, there was this strong belief that these were the followers of Satan, that they might in fact influence the godly to their side if they were allowed to live and follow their own ways. And I mean, I've called it Puritan paranoia, and that's really what it is. It's there are many, many authors of the 17th century, not just the Mather family, who saw this as New England as Satan's kingdom, and that here these noble crusaders who have come to subdue Satan's kingdom.
So anybody who wasn't them was evil.
Yes. Yeah.
Didn't get along with the Anglican neighbors either. So,
right. For sure. So, for example, they tended to use the word pagan to describe anything to do with either the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church,
or the natives, or
the natives.
I suppose the natives go all the way to devil.
Yeah, exactly. And so this in Connecticut, for instance, there was a witch hunt around Hartford where there was a pair who might have been more likely they were just sharing the customs they'd grown up with in Old England, but they were dancing around a maypole. They were having and they were celebrating Christmas. And that was one of the things that led to their being charged with witchcraft. That they celebrated Christmas and they celebrated May Day. So this were Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith, who were hanged probably where Trinity College is now in Hartford. You're thinking of Marymount, Chippewa, right?
Marymount.
Yes.
Yeah.
Marymount, is that I write about in the book. Thomas Morton was a colonist of Massachusetts. Now, he was, shall we say, I mean, he might not have been the greatest guy himself, but compared to the Puritans who opposed him, he seems positively enlightened. He believed in trading with the Indians. He saw no problem with them, and in fact, he had great relations with families, and he, would have parties. And one big party he had was to celebrate May Day by having a great big maypole dance. Well, this just this so incensed the Puritan settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that they launched a major attack on him, and they totally outgunned him and killed a few people, exiled him. They decided not to kill him, but to just kick him out of Massachusetts. And all this took place in what's now Quincy, Mass. And if you want to read the story, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about it in a nice short story called The Maypole of Marymount.
Oh, missed that one.
Yep, good story, and not a long read, easy to read. But Morton himself went back to England and wrote a really scathing account of this, and said that he saw the results of one of a battle against the Indians, where there were so many skulls piled up that it looked like Golgotha in the Bible, the mountain of skulls.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading that, and I was thinking that was that's essentially why I grabbed this music board.
Yeah.
The idea, the Indian Wars from those early years were apparently glossed over when I was in school.
Oh, yes.
I teared up several times reading about, I was like, boy, our ancestors, I am a descendant. Our ancestors were assholes. And this is why we need to keep church and state separate. They didn't want to.
Yes.
They wanted it to be their way.
Well, it was a theocracy, and the theocracy held on for a long time. People in Connecticut don't seem to realize that even though Connecticut signed on to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, they did not get around to separating church and state till 1818, some almost 30 years later. And even then, that was only when they abolished the punitive tax. Until 1818, if you were not a Puritan, if you were not a member of the Congregational Church, you had to pay a rather high tax, and that was for Anglicans, Quakers, they did not allow Roman Catholics to build churches in the state of Connecticut until the early 1840s. And they did not allow Jews to have a place of worship or to live in the state until close to the Civil War. So this is people, because of that, Connecticut has this nickname called the Land of Steady Habits. And some people seem to think it's a compliment. Wow, the land of steady habits, good, staunch people. No, it was a jeer from New York at, look at this, they signed the Constitution and they didn't read it. Yes, no deviating from the normal.
Yeah, and we get to decide what's normal.
Right.
But, let's see, I see we're almost a half an hour in. I don't want to miss the guilt that shows up in here about we want to hit misogyny and bigotry. Which do you want to go first?
Yeah, where to start? So misogyny, we can't just blame on the Puritans. I mean, that's the patriot, as they say. I blame the patriarchy. All of the European settlers, regardless of religion, brought with them the patriarchal order that they grew up with, and so it's not surprising that in New England, as in the rest of the United States, women did not have many rights. Now, the difference was New England did seem to have rebellious women, rebellious independent women who were willing to fight for those rights. So many of the causes, whether it was education for women or voting rights or abolitionism, and all were led by New England women. But the other way in which this incredible tension was expressed was through Gothic horror. And the haunted house theme and the idea of being immured. You were talking before about putting the black cat into the wall. Yes, uppity women, for sure. But if you were the good side, the light side, the woman was supposed to be the upper class woman, obviously not the lower class woman who had to go out and work, but upper class 19th century women were supposed to be the angel in the house. They were supposed to be the good influence on their husband and keeping him out of the tavern and away from all kinds of vice, and being an angel to their children and so on. Well, it turns out that a lot of women could not live up to that, and in fact felt the opposite. They felt like they were walled up in a house with their torturers, with their ghosts, with the ghosts of dead children, with the ghosts of abusive or alcoholic husbands who might still be alive, but were haunting them. And one way to express those feelings was to write ghost stories that we read them now, and they sound, we can feel that tension. Apparently at the time they were, oh, how entertaining, stories about ghosts, oh, stories about child ghosts, how sweet. But they're not. They're scary, and they're also, the subtext of all of them is how easy it was to descend into madness. I mean, one of the ways that the patriarchy has, I'll get to Alcott in a minute. She was the other kind of rebel. But these seemingly mild stories that were published in popular magazines and read widely, with the author's name on them, not anonymous, seemed to us to say, wow, if I'm too crazy, my husband's going to put me away. I'll be that mad woman in the attic. Now, the other way that women could express that frustration was through out-and-out sensational Gothic writing. And Louisa May Alcott, publishing under various pseudonyms, sometimes male, sometimes just initials, not her name, was able to publish pretty wild stories of women who ran away and had adventures and were murderers or encountered murderers, stories that we think of as highly Gothic and romantic and had romantic adventures in Europe. These were only found and republished, I was going to say, like yesterday, in the 70s, only 50 years ago. But
for some of us, that seems recent.
Yeah, but certainly were not known for many, many years after her death. But we know, all of us who grew up reading Little Women know about them because Jo did those things. Alcott was able to give, to hint at what she had been doing before she took the publisher's advice and began writing about domestic stories about what she knew. Those stories that Jo publishes in the Daily Volcano and the other the sensational newspapers are very close to exactly what Alcott did. Only she didn't have to go to New York to do it. She published them right in Boston. So
they were horror, so they're safe.
That's right. So the tradition of women writing pretty blatant horror goes way back, because in the first years of the Gothic revival in England, from the late 18th century into the early 19th century, women were at the forefront of those sensational stories. It was a way out. It was a way to get published. It's amazing.
Hey, if it sells, right?
So that's. But did that mean that misogyny was dead? No, far from it. Probably the most famous of these early feminist stories that had a subtext so blatant that it couldn't be ignored was Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. And the Yellow Wallpaper, hopefully people have read, widely assigned these days in schools and colleges, was based on an occurrence in her own life where she had strong postpartum depression, so strong that she said she was, she could not get out of bed and she couldn't care for her child and so on. And her husband sent her to a guy who was known as a great alienist. Before the word psychiatrist came about, the word alienist was often used. S. Weir Mitchell was his name. And he's like the poster boy for the patriarchy. He believed that all of women's psychiatric problems were because they were trying to break out of the normal woman's role. And so his cure for anything ranging from mild depression to complete psychosis was the rest cure. Put the woman in an environment with no stimulation, with no books, never to touch a pencil, never to touch a paintbrush, nothing creative, and just keep her there. Oh, yes, and to eat nothing but like bland, soft foods, like baby food, and keep her in this we'd call it a sensory deprivation mode. Well, strangely enough, some women got better really fast. That is, I will do anything to get out of this guy's clutches. Gilman said that she was so close to madness, this sent her so close to madness that she could see the edge of it. And she was somehow able to get out. She's not, even in her letters, somehow she might have she had friends who kind of rescued her. And eventually she went to California, where things were better in the 1890s. And she got her sanity back, but she always said that she was never the same. She had been so incredibly productive before then, but after this rest cure, so to speak, she never felt quite the same. Her protagonist in the yellow wallpaper, not so lucky, as you'll see. So the yellow wallpaper, 1892, lots of online versions of it from Project Gutenberg and all the rest, and I don't know how many pirate whatever different kinds of yes, a form of psychological torture. Yes, it's the kind of thing that torturers use to get a confession out of people.
Yeah.
But Weir Mitchell was very, very popular. He brainwashing. It was considered more humane than the asylums of those days, where essentially,
true.
which I'm sure it was. And, but there are all degrees of suffering. Yes. Conversion therapy. So this kind of misogyny, that's the late 19th century. Certainly we see it right up through the 20th century. And there's still, there are people out there who call themselves trad wives. I understand the big community online say same idea. We need to get back to the old woman's role and everything will be fine in the world. So, okay. So the other secrets of the Restless Dead, we've done the slaughter of the native peoples, we've done misogyny, but there's the guilt of slavery in New England and lingering racism and so on. Connecticut, by just a couple of weeks ago, Connecticut Public Television did a documentary called Unforgotten, about the history of slavery in Connecticut. And it keeps getting forgotten. I quote in the book the autobiography of a man named James Mars called Bought and Sold in Connecticut. And he was writing in the 1860s, and he was born into slavery in Connecticut. He was an old man in the 1860s during the Civil War, and he was compelled to seek his kids' aid in writing down his reminiscences because, he said, people have completely forgotten that there were slaves in Connecticut, and they tell me that I'm a liar, and they refuse to believe it. And that was the 1860s. You could say the same for the 1960s. If you go back to the I can't, Griffin. Yeah, I can't look at everything at the same time. Do you want to repeat what you just put?
But
you want to put what you just read, the sign in your father's tavern?
Yeah. In fact, it was kind of funny because the tavern happened to be right next door to Dad's gas station, and was built by the brother of the guy who built the gas station. So I got to read lots of little signs. I'd sit there sucking on an orange soda while Dad had his beer. And there were all of these sexist signs although the one over the door was just a string of letters that translated, why oh why is there so many more hawses asses than there are hawses? But I remember this one. Yeah, keep them barefoot in winter and pregnant in summer.
Wow. So thinking about the history of slavery, if I
that would have been about 1958 to 60, plus or minus.
Yeah. Well, thinking about the history of slavery in New England, Vermont was the only state in which slavery was not legal. All of the other New England states had slavery more or less, but mainly Rhode Island and Connecticut as far as numbers. Rhode Island had plantations. We forget about this, but if anybody remembers back to Camelot in 1976, and we camped at a former abandoned Boy Scout camp called Aquapog. And Aquapog was right in the center of the areas where there were slave-worked plantations, And this I didn't even know in 76. I only learned later that they would sometimes run away into that swamp where that lovely campsite was. And that swamp, I mean, if any place should have been haunted, it was that swamp, because before that, it was the site of one of the great battles of King Philip's War, the Great Swamp Fight. And then, as I said, there were, reports of slaves who had run in and intermarried with the few remaining native peoples and lived in that swamp. But so you had these plantations in Rhode Island, and you also had the people who benefited the most from slavery, even not in Rhode Island, were the first mills. The mills in Rhode Island and Massachusetts couldn't have existed if it weren't for the cheap slave-grown cotton from the South. And the saying was that the lords of the loom depend on the lords of the lash. Oh, okay. You've put up the black vampire that I refer to in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, that I'd never heard of that one either. And
yeah.
And I should have, because the whole concept of Haiti, I mean, if you get the triangle trade, you know about Haiti. So,
yes. Yeah.
Oh.
So by coincidence, I'm working right now on the introduction for an anthology of short stories called Monsters in the Mills.
Oh, and, I am going to so read the shit out of that one.
It is. I have the stories. I'm writing the introduction. I'm literally in the middle of it right now, but it's going to be out in time for this summer's Necronomicon Providence, the end of August.
Please come back. Please come back when you get it out there.
Oh yeah, yeah. The first anthology in the series is called We Are Providence: Tales of Horror from the Ocean State. And these are all Rhode Island writers, for the most part, couple of Connecticut and Massachusetts ones. And We Are Providence, of course, taking off on Lovecraft's I Am Providence, but they're not all Lovecraftian. But many of them are based on Rhode Island folklore and history. And then we meet once a month, and I said, well, now that we've done, sort of land and sea-based folklore, what about mills? What about haunted mills? And so they're thus the new one, which expands beyond Rhode Island. We got some Fall River, some Lowell, some of the other mills. They have to be haunted, exactly. And as I'm writing in the introduction, the monsters are so, yes, we can think of the machines themselves as monstrous. We can think of the overseers, the bosses as monsters. In their own time, they thought of the mill workers. Well, yes, King's The Mangler and Graveyard Shift, the one about the rats in the basement of that mill, definitely. I mean, that's, yeah. I'll be mentioning them, of course. But even the people who worked in the mill were thought of as monstrous, because as others, not human. It was okay to exploit the children, the mill workers. They were just immigrants, or they were just worthless. Their lives were worthless. But really, the monstrosity is the entire system. And it's not a coincidence that that these Gothic metaphors turn up in Karl Marx's writing. I mean, when he talks about capitalism as a system of vampires. So yes, now you have preview of coming attractions. But the other thing that I can boast about, besides my introduction to We Are Providence, is that it contains my one and only ever published work of short fiction. So I had to wait to age 7. It was published close to my 71st birthday.
What was the name of your story?
Mary's Mama's Heart. And it's about the New England tuberculosis consumption vampires, which is another story.
Yeah. So, so we have, but do talk more about the manifestation, how we express through Gothic our guilt over our participation in this heinous society. That are we, and I can assume that we are still using horror or the Gothic to express our guilt about the current system.
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, horror films, as you know, including the most exploitive, splattering ones, say something about our anxieties about sexuality, whether that sexuality is queer sexuality. Jenna knows that there's the whole genre of gyno-goth, men's horror at women's body parts, basically, and other anxieties about controlling women's bodies. Whether you are the victim of being controlled or you're someone who thinks that women should be controlled, horror is a blatant way of mirroring that without turning it into a documentary. Zombies talk about overly determined. It's not a coincidence that from the very beginnings of the new United States relationship with Haiti, they were worried about these, what could be more frightening to this white country than a country ruled by blacks who seem to have this pagan voodoo religion. So Haiti has been a locus of horror to the United States for 200 plus years. Today, it's all tangled up with fear of AIDS. It's tangled up with fears of gangs and the apocalyptic conditions in Haiti today, to the extent that Haitians in the United States are really worried because the bad side of the Gothic is that it also encodes all of the prejudices and all of the bad stuff. This is stuff that sometimes there are some secrets that you wish would stay buried. Germany, for instance, before Hitler, had a huge boom in two things. One was sort of romances about exterminating the Native Americans, as cowboy and Indian things that focused on the violence of killing Indians, and at various anti-Semitic horror novels about Jews who were seen as less than human. Well, what do you know? And that was even before Hitler. Clearly, it was reflecting a society that already had those fears and those prejudices. So on the good side, hopefully people get out their worst fears and prejudices by watching horror movies. That's one thing. It's another if they use them to inspire their actions in the real world.
Yeah. I remember reading Pet Sematary and thinking how perfect it was to have the protagonist be a doctor, because if there is any category of somebody who is more likely to fear death to the point where they're irrational about it, a doctor has been trained to think that death is the ultimate. No, we can't allow that. And almost anybody else might actually use their brain and say, no, that cat came back weird. I'm not going to do that to my kid. And I thought that was perfectly done.
Yes.
King catches that. Do you remember one of King's stories where there was a woman who liked to drive through the backwoods very, very
yes, Mrs. Todd's Shortcut.
The shortcuts. Oh my God, that was so creepy.
Yes.
Yet
And
she
that,
was,
yeah.
that's the wild force. That's the howling wilderness in the modern
Mhm.
world.
Yes, and it was based on his wife Tabitha, who always loved a shortcut and was constantly claiming that she could make the drive from their lake house to Bangor in less time and less distance. And she would always find these roads, and that inspired him. That's part of the inspiration.
That
The
was
other part,
Tabitha.
yeah. The other part was Mrs. Todd comes right out of Sarah Orne Jewett, who's another great Maine writer that I can't recommend highly enough. Whose Mrs. Todd is a self-proclaimed white witch in her stories of the country of the pointed firs. So, and several other stories. So Mrs. Todd is like a recurring character who has connections to direct connections to nature, heals, and is just an all-around wonderful character. Another Jewett story called The White Heron also features natural healing and kind of woman-centered traditions. So, gee, I hope you capture the chat. This chat is wonderful. I wish
We always save the chat.
Oh, great. This is great.
But it's
Yes.
also it's very important because when you save the chat, you save the links
Mm,
and people.
That's why we put them there.
yep.
That's why we
Thank
put 'em
you.
there.
This is excellent.
But
But
um,
we're going to save this one.
Yeah.
Well, I do hope that you'll follow Chipicon's suggestion and
yeah, go to your
tell
library,
go to your
the
library.
because if you
Mhm.
get it, you get the benefit, but then so does everybody else who takes it after you.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
Now I've been told, I was told years ago, so long ago that it's even before there were online databases, that my first book was highly stolen out of libraries.
Oh,
That libraries that did get it, it would show up in the catalog as missing. And it was explained to me that there's this problem. Well, on the one hand, there were people who wanted to have the book for themselves, but on the other, there were those people who didn't want it to be on the shelves.
ah,
So
Yeah.
I was
there you go.
getting it from both
well,
the
there's the I don't we're getting close to the end, and there was another thing I wanted to ask you about Schoolhouse Gothic, which to me resonated. So I mean, I don't think Roald Dahl and Matilda fall into that category.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When you
Absolutely.
talk about deep psychological scarring, there is the whole Schoolhouse Gothic. Yes, you get psychological and social trauma in school. What was it they said? Transforms students into sociopaths, machines, and zombies.
Yes.
Jeez, but that's so true. And kids, everybody who's had to go through it knows it.
Yep.
Carrie's a classic example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there are, of course, many movies with a high school setting, many horror movies because of the target audience that they. There's that wonderful. Oh yeah, Elizabeth Hand's Waking the Moon. Speaking of the Benandante from before, from Ginsberg, written based on her own college experiences at American University in Washington. But college folklore and folk horror is really interesting because on the one hand, it's a great place for people to pass down stories, but on another hand, you're only going to be there for 4 years. So when you get there, you don't know whether this tradition has been going for 200 years or 5 years. And so there's a wonderful book of college folklore called Piled Higher and Deeper. Right?
Yep.
The traditional explanation for PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And the folklorists have collected these stories, and it's amazing how they find them all, not only all over the United States, but all over the world, the same kinds of stories. I mean, they're the same kinds of hauntings, the same kinds of, depressed student stories. And of course, the idea of how long students are supposed to wait if the professor is late. Everyone has heard some version of that. You wait 15 minutes for a full professor and 5 minutes for a teaching assistant, or whatever. And of course, no college in the world has a rule like that, but somehow everyone thinks so. Is this a current TV show from Paramount?
Yeah.
Wow, a murder mystery. Cool. But yeah, the novels that I mentioned, Shirley Jackson's novel Hangs a Man from 1951 is about Bennington. There's like a Bennington College subtopic of the Gothic, and the famous one, The Secret History, set at Bennington, where the turn, of course, it's sacrifices in the woods and attempt to they're reenacting Greek myth. They're going to be reenacting the sacrifice out of Greek myth and the stories of Dionysus and so on. But
yeah, what man isn't afraid of a Menid?
Yeah, exactly. Scary, very scary.
Oh, we're getting too close. I wanted to ask you about. I had never heard of a indigenous tradition of vampirism, and
Well,
you mentioned.
Oh, but I don't mean indigenous in this case in the sense of the Native American tribes, but rather of the European. I probably shouldn't have used that.
I was just.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid, at least not that I've found any evidence for it, but
Okay. I saw the words in there that looked Native American. I said, "Ooh, geez, that's something I've never heard of before." Okay.
No, this is this is Euro-American, local. I should say more like local.
Last call for questions, guys.
What do you think about the recent trend to have ghost stories and Gothic stories where it's on a comedy angle and more of a accepting angle of the hauntings? The Ghost Show in the UK and on TV.
Oh, sure. Yes. Oh, I what a coincidence. I have an article coming out in this summer in a collection called The Companion to the Comic Gothic. And it's not a new thing. From the very beginnings there have been parodies of Gothic, and ones in which the spirits are benevolent and in which they're played for laughs. From the first famous example is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, her only, you might say, really comic novel in which her heroine has grown up reading all the Gothic romances and applies them to, she goes to stay at a rich person's home and decides for herself that it must be haunted and that probably they killed someone and put them in a chest and so on. Yes, Northanger Abbey. But
I thought it was lame. I didn't know it was supposed to be funny. So
well, it's not so funny to us, but then it was really funny because the people who read her kind of realistic novels generally were not fans of the Gothic novels, so they were,
sometimes you have to put your head in the mindset of the period it was written.
Okay, Griffin, you got
Griffin.
Can you be quick?
I'll try to be as quick as I can. First, a small memory from reading too much Lovecraft. And you talk about New England and the wilderness being evil. There was one story in which one of the scenes he set was a river where bodies of alien creatures were floating.
Oh, yes,
down
you're thinking exactly. You're thinking of the one that's set in Vermont, and now I've got and I've just blanked on the name myself.
Well, but he was very much there.
Oh, yeah. No, it's based completely on his visits to his friends in the Brattleboro, southern Vermont area. And it is based, and there really were floods in that
Yeah.
and the only the whisper in darkness. Thank you,
Yes.
thank you.
you.
And
Thank you,
what's
Charlotte.
fascinating is that what you've got, as far as it's truly science fiction as well as horror, because it introduces the whole idea of alien abduction, which was not a thing in the early 30s, late 20s.
Nice.
These aliens are going to take the brains of these humans and take them off to their
Wherever,
trans-Plutonian planet. Right?
So that's when that started, taking brains.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the other tidbit I wanted to work on was well, you mentioned that no Native American ethos about vampirism, but it immediately made me think about the number of Native American stories about cannibalism disguised
as in the Wendigo. Yes.
Wendigo.
The Wendigo stories.
Oh, Wendigo, his eyes are ice and indigo.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And the idea that he was a representation of the last resort that some of these transarctic people had to go through.
Right. Although the Wendigo stories are collected all the way, as far south, among the Algonquian speaking tribes, not as far south as Rhode Island and Connecticut, but definitely Maine and northern, the Northeast Kingdom, Vermont area.
Maybe periodic starvation was more common than we thought.
Yeah. Well, probably.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to have to say we're done, but I would definitely want you to come back, especially when your new book comes out, because obviously people here are going to be very eager to hear more about this. There's the 3 dots up at the top of the chat are where you can save it so that you get all the links and that we have put into the chat. Thank you so much. This has been really, really great. And I am enjoying the book. And so I'm going to push the button, and then you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's wonderful talking to people who
thank you, Faye.
understand.
I feel like we could talk